Okay, good morning and good day, everyone. My name is Berit Bliesemann de Guevara. I'm a professor of international politics at Aberystwyth University and the principal investigator of the project Creating Safer Space, which is the basis from which we're going to talk today about top tips of writing a successful grant application. Joining me in describing what these essential criteria are today is Professor Julian of Leeds Beckett University in the UK. And we also have here Katja Daniels for any questions that might come up. Katja is the what do you call the academic network manager of Creating Safer Space, and Rachel is also a co-investigator of that project, and we've all been involved in the process of actually choosing projects for funding in our funding competition. So I'm going to share my screen with a little presentation that we've put together. Katja, if you could just say if you can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just check whether that works. Yeah. Okay.
Could I just confirm if anyone else is having difficulties hearing what is being said? One of the people was having some challenges. Can everyone hear okay?
Yes, no problem. No.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Are you not hearing okay? Is that what you're saying?
No, I am. Somebody else put in the chat that they weren't.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, that must be on your side then. Okay, I'm just going to make a start then, and then I'll hand over to Rachel a bit later. So what we're going to talk about today is what we consider kind of the top tips of how to write a successful grant application. So what we are going to talk about is based on our own experience of holding a funding competition for the Creating Safer Space research network. So you may be aware that recently we held a funding competition. So we had a call for applications for projects on a specific topic, the topic of unarmed civilian protection and community self-protection. And for this call, we received 59 applications in total. And of these 59 applications, 50 projects met the basic eligibility criteria. I'm going to say a bit more about eligibility criteria in a moment. So we had two strands of our funding competition. One was a large grant scheme of projects up to £100,000, and we received 29 eligible applications for this large grant scheme, and in the end we were able to fund 6 of those 29 projects, so that's more or less a success rate of 21%. And we also had the small grant scheme where we received 21 eligible applications, so these were projects up to £30,000. And we were in the end able to fund 7 of those projects, so a 33% success rate. Now, if you were among those who didn't get funded, you will think, oh, this is not a very high success rate, but it's actually compared to funding competitions by big funders, it's actually quite high. So the success rates for those projects that were eligible to be judged was actually quite good. We received more applications for the large grant than for the small grant, which was a bit surprising. We thought it would be the other way around because the eligibility criteria for large grants were a bit stricter and a bit more complicated than for the small grants, but this is what people decided to apply for. Now, those 13 projects that we have offered funding to will focus on the core countries of our research network, Creating Safer Space, and those countries are Colombia, South Sudan, Myanmar, and the Philippines. And one of the reasons why these countries are at the core of the funded projects is because large grants had a criteria that at least 50% of their research had to focus on at least one of our core countries. So there's a reason why a lot of projects focus on these. But with the small grants, we were also able to support projects on other countries, including Cameroon, Palestine, and Nigeria. Overall, of those 13 successful projects, 4 will be led by organizations in the Global South, and 9 will be led by UK organizations or UK universities. But also these kind of UK-led projects all had to include co-investigators or project partners from the Global South. And usually there's quite a big component of Global Southern investigators or partners on these projects. Okay, so how did the process then of assessing the grant applications work? Each proposal was read by either 2 or 3 assessors, so 2 for the small grants and 3 for the large grants. And these assessors scored the proposals from 1 not fundable to 6 outstanding. So there was a range of scores. And then the assessors came together in an assessment panel and discussed their scores, and then came to a score for each proposal and ranked the proposals by quality. Right, so in the end of the 2 assessment panels, 1 for large grants and 1 for small grants, we had a list of the different proposals and how they were ranked by quality. There were 22 experts in total involved in this assessment process. So these were people who have a knowledge of peace and conflict studies or related topics related to our network, and who also have some experience in research and research funding, and who looked at the proposals very closely. Now, we've looked at this process and at the discussions and at the feedback the assessors gave, and we tried to distill lessons learned from this process of what makes a good funding application. And we have come up with 10 key elements of successful funding applications, and we hope by presenting them to you, it will help you in your future funding applications to be successful. So what are these 10? Here they are listed. This is from 1, meeting the eligibility criteria, 2, a clear understanding of the call objectives, 3, linking the application to the relevant literature, 4, a clear and detailed research design, 5, research with affected communities, not on affected communities, 6, a clear dissemination plan with regard to the beneficiaries, 7, a strong team with defined roles, 8, a sense of equitable partnerships, 9, a detailed and balanced budget, and 10, a clear idea of ethical issues and their mitigation. And we're going to go through them now one by one and explain what these 10 criteria mean. But just to say, although they were distilled from our specific process and our experiences, from other involvements we had as applicants or assessors of research applications, these are very much elements of successful applications in other competitions as well. So these are really of a more general learning, and they will be useful for you in whatever application you want to submit. One moment. Okay, here we go. So let's go through them one by one. I'll talk about the first 5 and I'll hand over to Rachel to talk about the next 5. So meeting the eligibility criteria is the first lesson learned, so to speak. And this may sound very commonsensical, but it's really important that if you put energy into writing a grant application, and this usually takes a lot of time, to really make sure the project meets the eligibility criteria, because if it doesn't meet the fundamental criteria, then it will not enter the competition. So you will not be able to compete with the other projects for the funding. And this includes 2 types of eligibility criteria. One is kind of the technical eligibility criteria. You usually find them in the call specifications, and it's important to stick to those because they are a first hurdle for the proposal to enter the competition. So this could be about, for example, which organizations can apply, which type of persons can be included in certain roles or cannot be included, which costs can be included in the budget and which costs are not eligible, and so on. So these are very technical things, but they are very important. There's a reason why the funder includes them. So it's important to meet these criteria. And then the second type of criteria, of eligibility criteria, is usually the thematic fit with the call specifications. So in our case, that was that we asked for research on unarmed civilian protection and nonviolent community self-protection. So that was the general kind of major theme running through both strands of our funding competition. And then there was a more specific criteria for large grants that they should focus at least 50% on one of our core countries. So these are the kind of thematic core specifications you have to keep in mind. Now, when our submission deadline came, we had those 59 applications. We sent quite a lot of these applications back to the principal investigator and gave them the chance to correct eligibility related issues if we thought that was feasible within a short amount of time. So they had a few days to correct some of these technical, mainly of the technical criteria. So for example, we asked for support letters from the lead organization and from the co-investigator organizations, and then maybe there was no support letter. So we said, can you please provide a support letter that confirms these and those things? So people had a bit of time to fix that. So this is something we decided we wanted to do, to give people a chance to learn in the process, but just be aware that with the big funders, they will normally not send proposals back to fix technical issues. So the better the proposal meets the technical criteria, the more chances it has to actually enter the competition. In the end, so even after this process of making small corrections, we ultimately decided not to send 9 of the 59 applications for review because they did not meet the criteria. And that was mainly because of the thematic fit. So if proposals were just not about anything to do with unarmed civilian protection or community self-protection, or was very hard to understand how they related to the themes, then we decided not to waste the assessor's time because these applications would not have had any chance in the funding competition. So 15% of the teams that submitted to us put energy into a proposal which was in the end not eligible for funding. So this is why I think paying attention to the eligibility criteria is really important. The second lesson is about a clear understanding of the call objectives. So what we found was that good project proposals explain well how they fit the specific call objectives. So this means reading closely what the call specifications say and trying to understand what it is that motivates the funder, in our case, our research network, or in other cases, it might be a funding council or a big donor NGO. So what is it that they are actually looking for, right? So I would say this applies to all calls for research applications. All of them have objectives. Sometimes they are more specific and sometimes they are wider or more open, right? So in our case of creating safer space, our objectives are quite specific because we have this umbrella network which has the objective to support research projects around the world that further our understanding of unarmed civilian protection and community self-protection. So this is a quite specific kind of objective that we have as a network, and therefore our call also had this very specific objective. But even when the objectives are a bit more widely formulated, there will still be something there that the funder is looking for. So some of our projects did not meet these objectives at all, and they were not submitted to the funding competition. So this is what I just talked about in lesson 1 about the eligibility criteria. But there were some other projects that were somehow linked to our objectives, but they did not show it well enough how they met the call objectives, or that was it was underdeveloped what this link was, or there were some other projects that tried to kind of rewrite the objectives a bit to make them fit the project they had in mind, right? So they tried to bend the criteria to fit their project. And in both of those cases, assessors viewed this quite negatively and scored proposals down. So they were lower, they could have been higher scored had they explained more what the call, how they link to the call objectives, and not tried to make the objectives fit the project they had already in mind. This is also kind of linked to the third lesson, which is about linking the application to the relevant research literature. So the lesson here is that the good proposals, the ones that were ultimately successful in obtaining funding or scored very highly in the ranking, were proposals that explicitly linked the project to relevant literature. So this could be academic literature, or in case of the small grants, also kind of NGO related reports and findings and so on. But they all showed how the project will make a new contribution to our knowledge. So not just repeat knowledge that is out there, but actually learn something new about a specific topic. In our case, this was a specific criteria in the call specifications that we outlined there, but it is also a general expectation for research funding that research projects make a new contribution to knowledge, generally speaking, because otherwise, what is the point of financing this research in the first place if we don't learn anything new that we hadn't known before? So when we look at the successful proposals, there were some proposals that really explicitly referred to the relevant literature on unanswering protection or community self-protection, and they explained how their project and the findings will further our understanding beyond what we already know. Now, this can be in kind of in supporting terms, it can be in critical terms, right? You can relate to the literature and show how things are not working the way it is claimed in the literature, but they all showed how they make a contribution to what we know. And then there were some other proposals that were successful in the end, which kind of made a link, but they were not as detailed or clear enough about what this link was or what this contribution to the literature will be. And our assessment panels had the opportunity to put conditions on awards. In this case, some projects were asked to produce a literature review to locate their project in relation to the existing knowledge as a condition for funding. So they got the chance to explain in hindsight a bit more in detail this link that they claim that was there between the project and the literature we are interested in. The fourth lesson, and I think this is one of the most important, they are all important, right? But this was really, really important, is a clear and detailed research design. So what we found was that the very good proposals all had a detailed and clearly thought through research design and methods section. So, and the assessors did read these research design and methods sections very, very closely. Why? Because they wanted to understand what exactly the research will consist in. So what actually will the team do, right? So you have, first you explain the research content and the questions and so on, but then the assessors want to know what will happen in the project, right? And how will that contribute to answering those questions? And they also read it very closely because they need this exact or this detailed information to then make judgments about the proposal's feasibility. So is it doable in terms of the timelines, right? So the work plan set out, are the team responsibilities fitting the research design, and is the budget adequate to finance the actual activities of the research? So this was a very important section. And some of the reasons why projects scored quite lowly was when there was a lack of detailed explanation of the research designs. Why? Because in this case, the assessors did not feel confident that the project could be delivered because they lacked information to make that judgment, right? So if they felt they didn't have enough information, they would rather give a lower score than a higher score because they weren't sure whether the project could be implemented or pulled off in the way suggested. And in some cases, there were particular methods in the proposal which are to be developed with participants in the course of the project. So, for example, participatory action research involves working with participants to come up with the research design and kind of decide on particular methods. But even in those cases, assessors expected at least some information on what the process will consist in and what methods could be expected and so on. So even if the team said this will be developed in the course of the research, it is not enough to say, oh yeah, we will do this later, but at least the assessors wanted to see kind of an indication of what might happen and how the process will be organized to come to these methods. So, for example, proposals could have discussed cases in which this method was used previously, and what came out of those processes and what can be expected from this particular one. It was also clear that an excellent research team was not sufficient to make up for a lack of detail on research design. So sometimes you see a research team and you think, oh, this is an amazing professor leading on this team. There are great organizations involved. They must do good research. But still, the assessors didn't feel confident just to judge the team and hope they will be able to implement a good research project. They wanted to see the detail on that design. And lastly, just to note, some projects were also scored low because they wanted to do too much in a short time. So it's not about putting more and more and more activities in, it's about the detail of the activities. So what are you going to do? For example, interviews. How many people will you interview? What type of people? What will you be asking them? How does that contribute to answering your questions and so on? So this is the type of detail. It's not about more methods. It's about detail about the methods that are useful for the study. So when there was too much going on, there were questions about the feasibility of the project within the time frame. Before I hand over to Rachel, the last thing, so lesson 5, I'm going to talk about was something that we called here research with affected communities, not on affected communities. So whether these were participatory action projects or kind of projects that used more standard social scientific methods of focus groups and interviews and so on, good proposals in the eyes of the assessors were those that reflected on what is in there for participants. So how do participants benefit from that research? The proposals that scored highest were in general also very strong on reflecting about the role of research participants and different types of beneficiaries of the research. So beyond the academics or the team doing the research, who else will benefit and how, right? And assessors were quite critical when projects did not give anything back to participants and only viewed them as informants or people from which you can extract data for your own research purposes. So when proposals were viewed favorable, so when they scored highly, the research design either included working with participants in some form, so participants were already included in the research design as co-researchers or had some input in the design of the project, or there was some other form of involvement of participants beyond data extraction, or the proposals were very clear about how the project will benefit the participants afterwards. So how, once the researchers have got the findings, they would go back and disseminate some of those findings to participants and to others so that it benefits them as well. We had a few research proposals that were seen to be quite extractive, so quite about participants just as informants rather than as beneficiaries. And just to say, those were sent in by teams led by UK organizations, but also by some teams led by organizations in low and middle income countries. So this is not only a problem of extraction of data in the global south by researchers in the global north, but it can also be a problem within a country in the global south, that academics just see communities as a place to extract data, but not a place or not a group of people to work with. And this was, and I think it's increasingly seen as favorable when participants are not just data providers, but actually there is something in there for the participants as well. With this, I hand over to Rachel. And you just tell me when you want me to go to the next point.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, so these the next sort of set of points are really quite linked to the importance of having a research design. So Berit talked about the need to have a really sort of like concrete plan and well thought through, and that you explain it really well. But I think there's also an element in which you set out your research design through various bits of the application, and you need to have a really strong coherence. So if you mention something in your research design about disseminating to local communities, then you have to really sort of fully explain that in your dissemination plan, and then in a few slides linked to your budget and things. So there's a really good sort of like piece of work to be done before you send it in, and checking that they all sort of fit there. So the dissemination plan is really about sort of like, how is anyone going to know what happened in your research project? So when the assessors looked at across the different things, they were looking at the dissemination plan. Does it look like the people who are going to benefit from your project and what you find out actually have a way of learning about it? And is that appropriate to them? So sometimes in the proposals, there needed to be more detail about that dissemination, rather than just saying we're going to make a radio program and a report, actually thinking about the process of doing that, and how that works within the specific area that you're researching. And then sort of linked to that, not just what you're going to do, but who are you going to be aiming that at? So who are those people who are going to take the report and actually read it or do something with it? And sometimes people forget a particular group who needs to know it. So we often think about sort of like other academics or maybe policy people, but we actually need to, the assessors were really looking for things like where actually the communities who are participating, hopefully, in the research actually hear about it afterwards. So thinking about all the different groups. And if you don't want to have a beneficiary group, sort of explain why they're not part of your plan. So it's really thinking through that bigger picture of what's going to happen after you've done the research. And again, there were some places where the dissemination plan don't list everything. Don't list everything you can think of about how to share your research. Think about what you're good at, what the people you're trying to get to hear about your results, what do they read, what do they listen to, and what do they look at, and make sure your plan meets them. So it's making your plan realistic and meeting the right communities. So that works really well. So yeah, so there's dissemination plan, and then alongside that you need the strong team. So whilst we said that a strong team is not enough to overcome problems with your research design, you also need to show that you have got a strong team. So it might be you don't need to have one person who's got all of the skills, but you do need to make sure you've got people who really understand the design, people who really understand the community that you're working with, people who understand the sort of like who you're trying to benefit as well. So the ones that did really well were ones that really spelt out how this team's going to work. So we've got these people, this is the role they're going to take, this is how we're going to work together. And that really works well. And you obviously want those people to be listed in the research design. So does someone come with a methodological skill, and how are they going to be involved? Have you included them all in the budget? That's a really good indicator to an assessor that you've really thought through everything and not just added somebody at the last minute and forgotten to put them in the budget. And also, so like if the assessors did really like it. So if there are people who have less experience, or who come in with a small component, can you help them also grow and develop their skills as part of being in your project. So conversely to that, some of the things that did not clearly defining the role. So is it clear who's leading the project and things like that? Sometimes there are tasks where you sort of say, we're going to do a radio program, but none of your team has any experience of doing that. So you want to make sure that you've got the right people doing the tasks and you explain how that's going to work. Next slide. So we talked quite a bit about the need to include and work with sort of communities, and this really comes under this idea of having an equitable partnership. And sometimes when you do an application, you're asked to explain very clearly why your partnership is equitable, why everybody is going to be included and heard and get a chance to contribute. So we didn't say that particularly in ours, but when the assessors were looking at it, they did look to the way in which the collaborations have been put together. So was it being overly led by one group of people to the exclusion of local communities? Was there sort of like a centralisation that maybe excluded team members from low middle income countries? I think what the assessors are really looking for is, have you really thought about like maybe sort of things like how the control of budgets and all that thing are going to play out, and so you've designed it so that the sort of like the roles are equally distributed. So maybe you've got two co-Is from different places who can collaborate together. Have you looked at the way in which your overall budget is weighted? So you don't want all of the costs to be maybe sort of like funding work done in the UK and only a small amount for local middle income country organisations. You want to look at it so it's sort of like it's balanced to where the research is going to be taking place. And again, we're thinking about in that partnership, are those people who want to build their skills got an opportunity to, and have you got the right people and ways of working that mean that your research is going to end up in the hands of somebody who really needs it? And I think that's a really important component. We're not just looking for dissemination that these things can be done, it's actually that the team are going to be able to do them together. Next slide. So we've mentioned quite a few times over the last few slides of budget, and it's like, and I know it can seem like sometimes when you get to do the budget, you've just got to sort of explain how you're going to spend this amount of money that you're allowed to apply for. But I think if you try and think about it slightly differently and start thinking about what is it you actually need to do. So at this point, it's going back to your research design. What do you actually need money to do? And that should match what you say in your design you're actually going to do. So if you're going to be spending, if you need to be spending several weeks in a place, or you need to be developing specialist skills, or you need to be having a large number of people involved, you really need to think about how you're going to pay for that, and how you make sure you've got the right people. So we've talked about having the right people in the team, how you're going to get them funded as well. So the assessors did look very closely at all the budgets, and one of them was value for money. So are the things that were in the budget reasonable? Were they justified in the text? So did they explain why they needed to be able to all spend 2 weeks here and then all have a big workshop together here? And did they explain how they were going to cover the cost of people who had to travel and stay there? So that goes along with sort of like the feasibility. So if your research design worked and you can fit it all in the budget, that looks really strong. So it's really thinking about how they do. Have you put in enough resources to do the work you say you're going to do in the research design? That works really well. And again, and this goes back to partnerships, have you matched the roles and the tasks with staff allocation? Have you allowed sort of like, if people are going to be developing their careers and learning new skills, that they actually have enough time within your project to do that, and maybe sort of training courses. So you actually look at how you're allocating the money to different staff, and then that overall view of where is the money going. So are you mainly trying to make sure that capacity is being developed in the site where you're going to be doing the research? So some of the areas that you maybe want to think about focusing on when you're doing your budget is making sure it's really detailed. So rather than just saying, oh, we're going to spend £5,000 on travel, you actually want to break that down and explain how many people are traveling, how have you come to that £5,000? It's much clearer, and then your assessors can link back and see how that links to your research design, and then how you're going to, and your partnerships and all of that. So match it well to your research design, your team description, and also explain why you need these things, and especially if some of those things are going to be provided by one of the team members or a local partner or something like that. So if you're not including accommodation costs for a workshop because somebody's going to let you stay at their centre for free, you still need to be able to put that in your budget so the assessors understand that you haven't just forgotten to put that cost in. And then think about how you're going to, or explain in your justification how this is all going to be sort of like managed. So have you got your lead organisation able to get that money out to the partners? Have you thought about what your partners need and will in order to use that money to do the things that they're asked to do in the project? So it's really, I would say, when you get back to here, that it's going back to your research design section and double checking everything's there. And then our last point is the ethics. So this is really quite difficult sometimes because we're working in an area which is full of ethical issues and full of things around sort of security and safety. We're working with people who are likely to have experienced all kinds of risks or I don't know, life things that have gone in their lives that maybe have been very difficult. And so thinking about ethics is really important right from the research design. So in the design, when you think about who you're going to work with, part of that is how are you going to make sure that they stay safe, that their data is secure, that nothing happens to them. And if your researchers are traveling, you want to make sure your researchers are okay as well. So it is thinking about that whole thing. And we always say in every single project, no matter how simple, there are always some ethical issues because you're always dealing with people. So you're always having to think about sort of like, what is it you're asking them to do? How much time do they have to contribute to your project? Whether or not they are being asked to do things that will be too traumatic or anything for them. So what we really want is people who understand that there are ethical issues and there are safeguarding risks and security risks in quite a lot of places, but that doesn't stop us doing the research, that there are mitigation measures that you can take, but you need to have done that. And that mitigation measure might involve other people coming and supporting you. So actually, if you are dealing with people who are recounting stories where they may have experienced trauma, part of your project, if you say your mitigation measure is that you're going to provide some psychosocial support, remember to add that into your budget and into your research design. So it's like an iterative cycle as you write it. You keep going back and thinking about it. So when we were looking at them, the assessors, all of them wanted to be very confident that the funded projects would do no harm to the researchers or the participants or the wider communities in which they sit. So all of them will look very carefully at how the ethics were set out, what if the security issues were identified, safeguarding and protection of data sections were all really well thought through. So the ones that scored highly showed a really good understanding of all of those different factors, and they provided detailed information about how they would mitigate them, so how they would reduce the risk. So actually, you could see that those projects have thought through, if this happens, this is what's going to happen, this is what we'll do, or this is how we're going to preempt that. So sometimes some important risks or ethical issues can be missing from the proposals. Sometimes there's not enough information on how you're going to mitigate them. So it's not really enough to say there are some security risks and we're going to take care. We actually want you to think through, does that mean the type of transport that you're going to take? Does that mean the type of communication system you're going to use? And so really thinking through, how does that go? And then again, you have to go back to your budget and check you've put them in, and all of that all the way through. But I think if you think through those, and sometimes it might be that in designing your research, you realize that you don't know enough, and that can be part of the process of really good research design, is learning what are going to be the ethical and safeguarding and security issues that you might encounter in doing this research. So it's all part of learning what you're going to be doing and how to do that within budget, ethically, and to produce some really good results that other people want to hear.
So yeah, I'm gonna stop the presentation now, but we have time, I think, for some questions as well. If you want more detail on any of these points, yeah, we have some 10 minutes. If you have any specific questions, so we're not going to talk about specific research proposals